Marco Polo was born in Venice around 1254. He came from a merchant family. His father and uncle were traders. They traveled across Asia and met Kublai Khan. Marco's father, Niccolo Polo, and uncle Maffeo left on a journey before Marco was born. They traveled through Asia and gained valuable trading experience. In 1269, they returned to Venice and met Marco for the first time. Soon after, they planned another journey, taking young Marco with them to explore new lands. Marco learned valuable trading skills from his family. He was taught how to judge the quality of goods and understand different currencies. His early years were spent in Venice, but he had little knowledge of Latin. He learned about trade and business, preparing for his future travels. Marco, his father, and his uncle started their journey to Asia in 1271. They traveled through the Silk Road, a famous route connecting Europe and Asia. Their journey was long and dangerous. They faced harsh weather, rough roads, and the risk of attacks from bandits along the way. Despite difficulties, they reached Kublai Khan's court. He welcomed them warmly. Marco impressed the Khan with his intelligence and curiosity. The Khan saw Marco as a useful person. He gave Marco important tasks and let him travel across Asia, learning and observing different cultures. Marco Polo left Venice in 1271 with his father and uncle. They traveled along the Silk Road, a famous route for trade. The journey was long and full of dangers. They passed through deserts, mountains, and many unknown lands. The Polos crossed the Middle East, Persia, and Central Asia. They faced bad weather and bandits on the way. The journey took years, but they finally arrived in China. They reached the palace of Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire. He welcomed them with great interest. Traveling the Silk Road was not easy for the Polos. They had to survive many hardships. Sometimes they did not have enough food or water. The mountains were cold and the deserts were hot. Some travelers got sick or lost their way. It was a journey that needed great courage and skill. They met different people and learned about new cultures. The Polos saw cities, markets, and new ways of life that were very different from Venice. After crossing many lands, they finally reached China. They arrived at Kublai Khan's royal court. The Khan ruled a vast and powerful empire. Kublai Khan was impressed by the Polos. He listened to their stories about Europe. Marco quickly became a favorite at the royal court. The Khan wanted to learn about the West. He welcomed Marco warmly and gave him important tasks. Marco's journey to China changed his life forever. Marco Polo met Kublai Khan, the ruler of China. The Khan liked Marco and gave him important work. Marco learned about Chinese culture and the way people lived. He worked as an envoy, which means he traveled to different places for the Khan. He saw many cities and met new people. He also learned how the government worked. Marco traveled inside China for many years. He visited famous places, watched people trade in busy markets, and saw how goods moved across the empire. The Khan trusted Marco and sent him on important missions. Marco saw great buildings, new foods, and new customs that were different from Europe. He traveled through large cities, saw beautiful palaces, and learned about Chinese inventions. He was surprised by how advanced the country was. Marco wrote about what he saw. He described paper money, busy markets, and strong bridges. His writings helped Europe learn more about China. Marco Polo saw many new things in China. He wrote about paper money, which people used instead of coins. This was special because Europe did not use paper money then. Another thing he learned about was gunpowder. Chinese people used it to make fireworks, but it was later used for weapons in Europe. This was new for many Europeans. Marco also visited large cities in China. He was amazed by their size and the markets. Many goods, like silk and spices, were traded there between different people. Marco Polo described Chinese traditions. He saw people wearing silk clothes, which were soft and expensive. He also noticed they used chopsticks instead of knives and forks. He was surprised by their houses and buildings. Many homes had curved roofs, which was different from Europe. He found these buildings very beautiful and well made. Another thing that surprised him was the mail system. Riders on horses carried messages quickly across the land. This helped the ruler know what was happening far away. Marco Polo also saw many exotic animals and plants. He saw elephants, which were not common in Europe. He wrote about tigers, which he had never seen before. He also described large bamboo plants. These plants were strong and tall. People in China used bamboo to build houses and make many useful things. Marco Polo's writings helped Europeans learn about these things. His book made people curious about China. Many later travelers wanted to see these things themselves. Marco Polo and his family left China in 1291, escorting the Mongol princess Kokochin to Persia. The journey was long and full of dangers, but they had to complete their mission. They traveled by sea, passing through Southeast Asia and India, before reaching Persia in 1293. After safely delivering the princess, they decided to make their way back home. On their way, they crossed through Persia and reached Constantinople. They faced many difficulties, but finally arrived in Venice in 1295, after nearly 24 years away. When Marco Polo returned to Venice, people hardly recognized him. He and his family had changed, and they brought many treasures from their travels in Asia. He shared stories of his adventures, but some people did not believe him. They thought his tales about China and the Mongol Empire were too amazing to be true. Despite doubts, his travels gave Europeans knowledge about new lands. His return marked the end of his great journey, but his stories would inspire many travelers in the future. Venice and Genoa were at war. In 1296, Marco Polo was captured. He was taken to prison in Genoa. He shared a cell with Rustichello da Pisa, a writer. They became friends. In prison, Marco Polo told Rustichello about his trips. Rustichello wrote them down. The book was called The Travels of Marco Polo. It described the lands Marco had seen. The book told of China, Persia, and India. It described strange animals, riches, and cities. Many in Europe had never heard of such places before. The book became popular. People read Marco's book with interest. Some believed his stories, but others did not. They thought the book was full of lies or made-up tales. Marco always insisted they were true. The book brought new knowledge to Europe. People learned about Chinese paper money and black stones that burned like wood. These were things unknown in Europe at that time. Even Kublai Khan's court was unknown to many in the West. The book gave details of its wealth and power. It was one of the first books to give such a deep look into Asia. Marco Polo's stories inspired explorers. They wanted to see the world he described. His book became very important for travel and trade. It was copied many times across Europe. The book was written in different languages. It spread to many countries. It helped shape European ideas about the world beyond. It showed them that Asia was rich and advanced. Marco's time in prison ended in 1299. He returned to Venice. There, he continued his work as a merchant. But his stories and book would continue to inspire others for centuries. Marco Polo was freed from prison in 1299. He returned to Venice and started a new life. He became a wealthy merchant. He also got married and had 3 daughters. Marco Polo lived a comfortable life in Venice. He continued to work in trade, using his knowledge from his travels. His wealth allowed his family to live well. In his later years, Marco Polo remained in Venice. He continued to share stories about his journeys. Many people admired him, but some did not believe his tales. Marco Polo stayed active in business until his health declined. In 1323, he became very ill. Doctors tried to help, but his condition worsened. Before he died, he made his will. He gave his wealth to his family and some to the church. He also freed a servant who had come with him from Asia. Marco Polo passed away in 1324. He was buried in the Church of San Lorenzo in Venice. His travels and stories left a lasting impact on the world. Marco Polo's book was very important for European explorers. It gave them the first real look into China and Asia. His stories made people curious about the world. The book helped map makers improve their maps. Before Marco's book, people knew little about Asia. Thanks to him, maps became more detailed and useful. Many travelers later followed Marco Polo's path. He made people dream of adventure. His journeys inspired famous explorers like Christopher Columbus. Marco Polo described a different and rich world. He wrote about cities, trade, and new inventions. Many things he saw surprised Europeans. His book introduced paper money and beautiful Chinese art. Readers learned about new foods, plants, and spices that were unknown in Europe. Because of Marco's book, Europe wanted to trade more with Asia. His writing helped connect cultures and changed how people saw the world. Marco Polo's stories helped create new maps. They showed places never seen before. His work made later explorers feel more confident traveling far. People in Europe started to believe in a bigger world. The stories of the Great Khan showed them that other lands had powerful leaders too. His book stayed famous for hundreds of years. Even today, people read about him and learn from his experiences in Asia and beyond.